There's this, I don't know if you remember it, there was a television show that was called Magnum P.I. And like all things you see on TV or on the networks anyway, it was, the stories were always very, very well constructed, with a beginning and a middle and an end. I always had this theory that the Aristotelian idea, this has something to do with visual images, so I hope I can hook it up, but that the Aristotelian, oh God, I just came in from the cold and I've got this, the Aristotelian idea of a well-constructed plot with a beginning and middle and end. Actually, there's a point on poetry where Aristotle says that a good plot is like a good composition. And there, I had this idea of Aristotle in Hollywood, that, you know, how to write a screenplay and all those things. That all the people who do that and do it professionally, either consciously or unconsciously, are using those same principles, the same ideas about how things should be put together so that they work, so to speak. And then the other day I saw at Barnes & Noble someone had done something, how to write a screenplay according to Aristotle. But this is nothing new. I mean, and none of these ideas, either about visual form or literary form or form in general, are new ideas. The idea that I want to get across, in a way, is that there isn't it's not that there's nothing new to be said, but in a way there's nothing new to be seen here. It's just a question of whether we're really seeing it. Anyway, there would be these points where Magnum P.I. would be, he had a fancy car, I forget what kind it was, that was a big part of it. Not of the plot, but the decor, and it was he'd be driving along this scenic shore road in Hawaii where it took place, and there would be a voiceover because these, you know, all a crime story. And sometimes it would say, it was Tom Selleck's voice saying, "I know what you're thinking, and you're right." And then other times he would say, "I know what you're thinking, but you're wrong." And that would mean there would be a twist in the plot. I know what you're thinking. You think this is going to be a slide lecture, but you're wrong. It's going to have the form of a slide lecture, but not really be a slide lecture in the sense that of a proper art historical run-through. We're going to be going really fast and leaving lots of things out. And in a way, it's I want to be serious, but not serious in the way that's usually associated with slide lectures. Anyway, let's start. I thought I'd start with this one, and in a way, for what I want to say, I could just leave this slide on the whole time. Well, I'd have to change it to a Michelangelo one at the end, but, you know, because that's in the title. This is the Venus de Milo. It's thought to be from about 100 BC, the Hellenistic period. But there's a kind of a twist in this. It's, for various reasons, it's thought to be Hellenistic, but it's a Hellenistic sculptor reviving a classical ideal. So that means somebody 100 years before Christ doing the sort of thing that people at that point still remembered had been done in the 5th century BC in Athens. So that idea, which is the idea I want to talk about, has been preserved over these 4 centuries and recreated. When this was first dug up in the 1820s, It was just thought to be a classical sculpture, but there are various reasons for thinking that it's a bit later. It all has to do with proportion and contrapposto and so on. About Hellenism, that starts around 400 BC and carries on until Rome sort of takes over in the century before Christ. The reason it's said that this is a kind of classical revival being done 400 years after that ideal was formulated is because of the proportions, partly, and also something that we'll be coming back to a lot, the notion of contrapposto, the idea that all the weight isn't on one leg. Now, the contrast there is with an image of this kind. This is archaic. It's from the century before the classical period. This is a kouros from about 525. It's 525 BC. There's sort of the beginnings of contrapposto, but basically it's squared away. The elements are all there. In other words, the body is there in a more or less proportionate way. But there's something not exactly lifeless about it, but kind of blocky and not yet really animated in the way things are going to get animated. This is extreme contrapposto. So extreme that you really wouldn't call it that, I guess. This is Myron's discus thrower. It's a copy. It's a Roman copy. Lots of these things are copies, not originals. It's in marble. The original is thought to be in bronze. It's from about the middle of the 5th century BC, 450 BC. There are three goddesses. I haven't said much about the size of these things. They're all about life size or bigger. Here are three goddesses from the Parthenon. These are among the marbles that ended up in the British Museum. That's a decade or two earlier than the original of the discus thrower, the Discobolus. Now this is supposed to be about the nude, and these aren't nude exactly, but for reasons I hope will be clear in a while, these are as good as nude, or they're as good as naked in the sense that the body is naked in this tradition. The drapery is designed not to obscure the body, but to accentuate it, or accentuate certain aspects of it. So I wanted to throw this in, even though it's not strictly speaking a nude. And also this way of defining the body through hiding it in a certain way appears later on, or tomorrow night, in certain images, and so I wanted to sort of prepare the way for that. This is a Nike from the Temple of Athena. This managed to stay in Athens. It's right toward the end of the classical period, early 5th century BC. Again, a draped figure, but draped in a way that brings out what all these sculptors, whether they showed the body literally nude or not, want to bring out about the body. It has something to do with proportions and rhythms and forms that in a certain way take over in their own right. This is in the Hellenistic period. Hellenism is it's sort of like postmodernism in a way. There are lots of different things that get called that. They all occur in more or less the same historical era, so they get the same label. Some Hellenism is very agitated and expressive, as we'd say now, even grotesque. Some of it is very refined. and a bit willowy and maybe a bit bland compared to the classical models that these are working off of. I'm not sure one would want to say this is bland. It's a tall Hermes. It's over 7 feet tall. It's by Praxiteles. Maybe it's one of the few originals that we'll be looking at slides of from this period, maybe not. It's really not clear about all these things. And that, in a way, gets me back to the Venus de Milo, and why, in a certain way, it would be enough just to look at that if that weren't too tedious, because we're not really dealing with works of art in the sense that we would be dealing with works of art if we were doing a lecture on Turner or Pollock or something like that. In other words, someone like that, someone where there's a clear historically established relationship between the work and the artist, where there's a clear idea or a very good guess about when it was made, where it comes in the sequence of the artist's works, whether it actually belongs to the oeuvre. All of that is something that art historians of this period, of course, worry about a great deal and work very hard to establish, but in a certain way, it doesn't take anything away from our sense, or even in a sense, our knowledge of these works if we can't establish that sort of thing. These are not works of art. These are not works of the individual imagination. These are not contributions to a clearly defined oeuvre in the way that work in our period, in the modern period is, or even in the Renaissance. It's a little different. And there are reasons for looking at this work may be somewhat different as well. We have these names, Phidias, Myron, Praxiteles, and so on. We try to figure out what's a copy, what's not, what's Roman, what's Greek, what's a good copy, what's a bad copy. But it's all a little bit like looking at Greek painting from the classical period. There are no Greek paintings from the classical period that we can look at. We can only read about them in the commentary. And so we're at a certain remove from all of this. But I'm going to try to suggest why that's not a problem. Because what I think is at stake in these works is at stake it's at stake in them whether this is a copy of a Praxitelean sculpture or not. Anyway, it looks it's a very good one, whether it's a copy or not. It's good in the sense that the proportions are very clear. In other words, the observable and familiar facts of human anatomy have been arranged and rearranged in patterns that are immediately perceptible, immediately graspable, or as the people in this time would say who thought about these things, they're intelligible. Order has been imposed. It's not this kind of strict or rigid order that we saw in that archaic statue, the Kouros. It's a kind of order that acknowledges something that the very idea of order in ancient Greece was designed to transcend. That is to say, the contingencies of ordinary behavior and experience. This contrapposto, this putting the shifting most of the weight onto one leg so that there's a kind of S curve that goes through the body. This doesn't really represent the way people, I mean, you can assume these poses, but it's really not the way people behave. It's not what we see, but it's kind of a reminder of the body, that the body is not merely articulated, but that those articulations are for the sake of certain kinds of movement, standing, walking, sitting, and so on, so that an intelligible order has been infiltrated by, at the very least, a reminder of that which the order is trying to transcend, that which the clarity is trying, in a certain way, to get beyond, and that is the contingencies of just ordinary behavior and experience. Praxiteles was known in his own time and by ancient writers as the one who was the best at dealing with the female form. This is a Roman copy of one of his works from around 330 BC, Aphrodite of the Cnidians. It's in the Vatican Museum. It's more than life-size. It's 6 feet 8 inches tall. And the arms are missing. We can't really know what they would have added to the rhythms or the form of this sculpture. But you see the extraordinary elegance, refinement, understatement of the S curve around which everything is organized. Really elegant contrapposto. And yet not exactly classical. One of the things one of the ways of establishing order in the classical period, when a Venus or an Aphrodite was sculpted, was to make there's a kind of equilateral triangle from the navel to the two nipples. Here it's elongated a bit. The typical of Hellenistic refinement. It's similar in a way, and I'm not sure what to make of these recurring patterns. It's similar in a way to the neoclassical forms of the Renaissance that then become elongated and more elegant in a certain way in mannerism. It's as though Hellenism of this kind, this serene kind, stands to the serenity of classicism as mannerism stands to the Renaissance. Again, I'm not quite sure. Not being a Hegelian, I don't see any necessity for these patterns to recur, but they sort of do, or maybe we just impose them. I'm not sure. This is the agitated side of Hellenism. The Laocoon. Laocoon was a priest in Troy, and he warned the Trojans not to take the wooden horse into the city. And of course, he was right, but the Trojans ignored him and they lost the war. But before that happened, Neptune decided that that Laocoon should have kept his mouth shut. So he sent this serpent to torment him and ultimately kill him and his two sons. Now this was a fascinating subject for the 18th century neoclassicists, because they felt that the great thing about this work that we've been looking at, especially from the classical as opposed to the Hellenistic period, is that it was so dignified and so exemplary in its decorum. A lot of what we now think of as proper behavior or decorous behavior was formulated in the 18th century, sort of early modern period, and those people who formulated it, these ideals of decorum and so on, were helped along the way to these formulations by looking at ancient sculpture. So when they ran across this, they were a little troubled. I mean, they had it as sort of an axiom that anything this old had to be great, and yet there was this kind of agitation, this kind of indecorousness in a way, I mean, everybody knew that it was great. There's a possibly apocryphal story that Michelangelo was present when this was dug up in near Rome in 1506. Michelangelo is thought to have said this is a singular miracle of art. We should grasp the design genius of the craftsman rather than try to make an imitation of it. Already in 1506, the Renaissance idea of classicism had gotten to the point where there was a certain backing away from this image of torment, this idea that this wasn't really perhaps a proper subject for art. And then there was a great deal of discussion from Michelangelo's time through to Winckelmann's time in the 18th century about how we can think of this so that we can think that it's really great. We don't have to think that it's hyperbolic or possibly even a bit vulgar, a bit melodramatic or whatever. Joshua Reynolds, in one of his discourses, said that the good thing about it was that though Laocoon and his two sons have more expression in the countenance than perhaps any other antique statues, in other words, they run the risk of being too expressive, melodramatic, yet it is only the general expression of pain. And this passion is still more strongly expressed by the writhing and contortion of the body than by the features. In other words, this is a good thing from their point of view, that it was not, by their, I mean the neoclassicists nominating Reynolds as their spokesman, that the restraint, even though this is a violent scene, this is a death scene. People dying, these are death agonies, death contortions. And yet, and that's pretty clear that something horrendous is going on here, but Reynolds and others find a way of seeing it as decorous after all. And they look for and find, and perhaps rightly so, a generality that rescues it from the particular. The particular subject is pretty gruesome, pretty unpleasant, but somehow it's redeemed by its generality. Winckelmann was upset. He's Reynolds in English, Winckelmann in German, great formulators of these classical ideas, neoclassical ideas based on antique works. He talks about the pains of the body, which are not really considered a suitable subject for art, indecorous, sort of cheating in a way, like presenting images of pain, calling too powerfully on our empathetic responses. That this isn't quite fair. We can't really maintain a serious or proper attitude toward them as works of art, but somehow that in Winckelmann's phrase, a grandeur of soul is also infused through the body with the feeling of pain, and that somehow overcomes it and makes it all right to see this as a great work of art. You can see that they're not quite convinced, that they're much more at home with the Venus de Milo or possibly this is a statue that was an immense favorite in the 18th and 19th century, the Apollo Belvedere, and then in recent decades, possibly for a century or so, it was thought to be too refined, too willowy, perhaps a bit bland. So taste, I don't want to generalize too much. This taste, this idea that anything old is great, is also subject to fashions, or there's a kind of fashion that nominates this or that sculpture as the embodiment or the perfect example to prove the axiom that anything old is great. But this idea that that's the case, I want to talk a little bit about how that could have gotten to be the case, or what it is that we think is so great about these ancient sculptures. And I want to introduce a couple of words, Greek words. One of them is rhythmos, which obviously is the source of our word rhythm. And when I talk about, well, there's plenty of rhythm in this. It's a rather complicated set of rhythms and counter rhythms. But what neoclassicists, and perhaps we too, find easier to deal with and maybe more convincing in the long run is a simpler rhythm. A kind of an S curve is a thrust, a counter thrust, and a thrust. And the hope is that rather abstract schema can be integrated with the forms of the body in a way that don't do any injustice to the idea of the body, but at the same time make the rhythm itself, this zigzag basically, powerful, entrancing. be a question about what it is that's entrancing about these images. But for now, I just want to talk about rhythmos. There's a sort of late Hellenistic writer called Callistratus who talks about Praxiteles. He says, indeed, in the hands of Praxiteles wrought works which seemed thoroughly alive. There was a grove, and in it stood an image of Dionysius in the form of a youth of such delicate softness that the bronze seemed to change its form to that of flesh, and the body was so supple and relaxed that it seemed to be made of some other material, and not bronze. If you read through these extracts, fragments, and so on, where the word rhythmos is applied to works of art, or works of architecture for that matter, you get the idea that it's a little larger concept than our concept of just rhythm. Sometimes it seems to mean just shape or shapeliness. Sometimes it even seems to have the notion of style, that something is done in a certain style, but that's a little too particular, a little too specific. The larger sense of it seems the rhythmos has something to do with not just formal qualities, but somehow formal qualities that imbue inanimate matter with life. It's sort of rhythmos in the sense of a vital pulse of some kind, an animating spirit. Sometimes that's one notion that I'd like to suggest is at play here. Rhythmos in a large sense, a sort of a rhythm, a life-giving rhythm. But then there's the question of what sort of life it is and how we're supposed to respond to these things. If I can find it, there's an extraordinary quotation from Flaubert, one of his memoirs of visiting an art gallery. He sees a work by Canova, a neoclassicist. Unfortunately, there's no slide available, or I will be showing it tomorrow. It's a picture of a sculpture of Psyche and Cupid. You know, Aphrodite is the major figure, goddess of love, but Cupid sort of does her bidding. Well, you know about Cupid and so on. And there's a story of Cupid and Psyche, their union. And Canova did an extraordinary image of this. He's called a neoclassicist. This is sort of like a neo-Hellenistic, very complicated, it's as complicated as the Laocoon, but in the round. Extraordinary poses and quite striking, whether you like it or not. Flaubert really loved it. He said, "I looked at nothing else in the gallery. I returned to it several times, and at last I kissed the armpit of the swooning woman who stretches her long marble arms toward love, and the foot, and the head, and the profile. May I be forgiven. It was my first sensual kiss in a long while." It was also something more. I kissed beauty itself. It was to genius that I dedicated my ardent enthusiasm. Now, this leads me in a kind of roundabout way to the second ancient Greek word that I'd like to talk about, and that's mimesis. Imitation of nature, representation, and so on. And also to look at the idea of mimesis in the light of Flaubert's behavior. I don't know if he actually did this. When he was in the maybe if he was alone with it, he did. I don't know, but he wanted to, obviously. And the thing is, what did he really want to do, or what did he do? What was he doing, for God's sake? I mean, it's if mimesis is, well, what is mimesis? I mean, we translate it as representation or imitation of nature. It's a little difficult to talk about mimesis these days because the idea of art as representation is kind of old-fashioned. It's been supplanted ever since the Romantic period by the idea of art as expression. And then there are other ideas that have come in since then, the cognitive theory of art and so on. And mimesis is something that's either taken for granted or thought to be superseded, except there's a very interesting theory or a theoretical use of the idea of mimesis in Arthur Danto's idea that Andy Warhol, all appearances and everything else to the contrary, is a great philosopher. He claims that in 1964, this is almost like Flaubert and Cupid and Psyche. It's one of these moments in the gallery with an artwork. Something at first sight. You know, you're never quite sure what it is, but he sees a Brillo box by Andy Warhol in 1964, and he sees in a flash, art is over. This is it. This is the final work of art. There were a lot of people saying things like that about various kinds of art in the 60s and so on, but Danto was pretty quick off the mark. He was one of the first to say, and it was as I understand it, it's a mimetic theory that's at work here. His point, and I don't agree with it just on empirical grounds in a way, it doesn't look this way to me, but that's not so important. The argument is that the Brillo box by Andy Warhol is just like the Brillo box from the supermarket shelf. Now, as I say, it isn't, but let's say for aesthetic purposes it is. And at that point, according to Danto, art comes to a certain culmination. Because if the thing that it is as a work of art and the thing that it represents as a work of art are indistinguishable, then the only thing that says that the work of art is a work of art has to take place, it is some matter of definition. You simply stipulate that the Warhol is a work of art and is treated as such, and the other is simply a supermarket item. Now, let's think of that theory applied to the human body, like this Greek idea of mimesis. If the Greeks, I'm not sure that, well, no, the Greeks didn't have the technology to do this. I guess, I hope we don't either, but if that were done with the human body, or say Canova had done that with these two, a male and a female model who he called Cupid and Psyche, and there was no the mimesis was perfect. In other words, mimesis was replication, which is what Danto says is going on with the Brillo box. If it were that, then there would be no distinguishing Flaubert's experience with the Canova statue from a sexual experience, because these would simply be they would be indistinguishable from real bodies. And so when he kisses the armpit and so on, it would be the foot and the rest of it. It would simply be, not only would the sculpture be a perfect replication of bodies, this response, this physical response of Flaubert's would be identical or indistinguishable from a sexual experience. But Flaubert is very careful to add, it was also something more. I kissed beauty itself. It was to genius that I dedicated my ardent enthusiasm. In other words, he's not having what, in any ordinary sense of the word, we would call a sexual experience. He's having, and he's claiming, and I think we can grant the claim, he's having what we would call an aesthetic experience. So this idea of mimesis, seems to me right from the beginning, was never about replication. It was always about a kind of reference or a kind of evocation of a subject. often one that accounts for and presents many of the details of the represented object, the object of mimesis, but is never, I mean, sometimes maybe if you were in a certain kind of room and there was a statue off in the corner, out of the corner of your room, your eye, you might think it was or a Dwayne Hansen, you know, those fiberglass replications, or sometimes even a George Siegel, you know. But you never really think that they're bodies, no matter how lifelike. We use that word, but they're not lifelike, and that's not a failing. They're not intended to be lifelike, and Flaubert doesn't intend to present himself here as having a sexual experience. He intends us to see him as a devotee of pure art, and he's praising Canova not for the sexiness of these images, but for the artistic value, the beauty of them, which is to be understood as an aesthetic quality, not a sexual quality. Now, this all has to be understood. I mean, as we know, anything can be an object of a sexual attraction. And maybe, there are people who fall in love with, but what I'm talking about, I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is the way these things were meant and the way they've had their meaning over the centuries and the millennia. So mimesis is not an attempt to make things lifelike. It's not, actually imitation and even representation is a rather poor translation of that Greek word. It's an extraordinarily subtle word. I mean, there are passages in Plato where someone, I'm not sure if it's Socrates or who, says that music is mimetic. Not that it imitates a bird song or something like that, but that the forms of music imitate some quality, some intellectual quality, some emotional quality. If music can be mimetic, then the mimesis that we see in these seemingly lifelike images is not what we may think it is. It's not about being lifelike. In fact, it's about transcending the life in these forms. And then the question is transcending it toward what? And there I would like to move on to the next of these Greek words, symmetria. The thing about these Greek words is they have a kind of fatal similarity to words in our own language, which obviously derive from these Greek origins. But symmetria is not symmetry. I mean, symmetry as we know it, like identity on two sides of an axis or whatever, again, it's rather simple. It's a rather simplified notion of symmetry. See if I can find a there's the physician Galen has this comment about Chrysippus, who was a Stoic philosopher. Galen, father of medicine, was interested in bodily health, and so he was interested in this thought from Chrysippus. Now, this is Galen referring to Chrysippus, the Stoic philosopher. Beauty, he feels, resides not in the commensurability of the constituents, i.e. of the body, but in the commensurability of parts, such as the finger to the finger, and of all the fingers to the metacarpus and the wrist, the carpus, and of all these to the forearm, and of the forearm to the arm, and in fact of everything to everything. I mean, that's, I hope what I say in a little while will, in retrospect, give a kind of resonance to that phrase. It's relationship of everything to everything. He's seeing it start in the body, in the small parts of the body, being related to the larger parts. And he's talking now not about health, but about beauty, but he sees a kind of connection between the two. But this also suggests a different idea about beauty, that it's not that kind of beauty as we think of it as a quality of an image, but more of a way of being, or of a kind of articulation of some kind. Commensurability of parts. Of everything to everything, as is written in the canon of Polykleitos. So all sorts of things are being woven together here. Galen is talking about beauty, physical health, and by way of Chrysippus, who's talking about measure and proportion and so on, he gets to the canon of Polykleitos, as one of the sculptors defines what we call the classical age in Athens. This canon, it's thought that Polykleitos actually did write it, but it hasn't survived. Now this is Galen again. For having taught us in that thesis that all the symmetria of the body, Polykleitos supported his treatise with a work, meaning a statue, having made the statue of a man according to the tenets of his treatise, and having called the statue itself, like the treatise, the canon. So that at one point, if Galen is correct, there was a statue that embodied Polykleitos' idea, anyway, of the perfect commensurability of parts to parts. And this is about symmetria. Sometimes symmetry, especially in the 18th century, is used in that same way to mean harmony, compositional completeness, balance, and so on. It's the kind of thing that gets its origin in the contrapposto, that first departure from a strict schematic rigidity of form. We, as moderns, like to read into it a kind of bringing of life, or a lifelike quality to the work, and it does do that, but there's more at stake than that. It's not just for it to be more realistic, as we would say. These images are not in the least bit realistic in a certain way. And we don't really begin to see them until we begin to see that they're not realistic. They have to do with the embodiment of rhythmos, of using mimesis, which is this imitation in a way that somehow gets at the spirit or the form of something. And the sign that that has been achieved, the sign that the form is complete, the form is realized, the form is harmonious, is that it has rhythmos, this sort of life pulse into it. Not a mere realistic effect, but a kind of very generalized, you could even say in our terms, abstract sort of life pulse in it, and this symmetria, this commensurability that we would call harmony or good composition or whatever. All of those things tend to take the image away from this kind of mimesis, as in the story of how the Brillo box in the gallery is identical to the Brillo box on the supermarket shelf. That seems to me a very modern and perhaps pertinent, but very narrow notion of what mimesis is. I'm suggesting that all these things, representation, mimesis, rhythmos, the kind of liveliness, the symmetria, harmony, and composition, have to do not with giving us a lifelike or realistic image of anything, and especially not the human body, but of transcending it. And the question is why one would want to do that. And that's going to take us away a bit from art. Into ideas that I think are still with us in a certain way. We don't think about them very much. My feeling is that all of this is intelligible in ways that we generally don't articulate to ourselves, that we don't I suppose it's not that we spend a lot of time looking at antique sculpture in any case, but when we do, these works do have this kind of intelligibility. They have this kind of familiarity. Even if one hasn't seen one before, one knows in a certain sense what it's about, or one has an intuition of it. But it's very hard to bring that out because it's so familiar. It's hard to bring it to articulate it because it's so familiar. It hardly seems to need articulation, and perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps for many practical purposes, like doing art and so on, it doesn't need to be articulated. But there's some interest in sort of seeing what's at stake here, what's being put up for grabs. And at this point, there's often a move into depths, into mysteries. The idea that there's a kind of a surface, the familiar surface, the Venus de Milo, this. These works by Praxiteles and so on, or the Apollo Belvedere, and that but somehow we have to look past the surface into depths, and that would certainly be in line with these ideas that I want to try to articulate and relate to these forms and to forms that go all the way up into our own time. But I'm going to be doing something a little complicated here. At the same time that I'm trying to talk about ideas that do have to do with appearance and reality, surface and depth, accident and necessity, the contingent and the internal, I also want to make it clear that I don't believe in those oppositions at all. I don't think there are any depths to plumb here. It's all on the surface. It's all visible. It's just a matter of seeing it, or seeing it in the right way, or what I think is the right way anyway. So to get at all of that, what's at stake here? Why is this, on the one hand, seeming so familiar and approachable and intelligible, and why would I say that there's something here that for the most part we don't see, or that we see so automatically and we interpret with such ease that we don't even notice that it has that meaning for us, the meaning that we find in it. There was all these images are of gods and heroes and so on. We say that the Greeks were polytheistic as opposed to the Jews and the Christians, and then a little later on in Islam. Polytheism versus monotheism. And there's no denying that there are a lot of gods, I mean, we've been looking at images of them in ancient Greek culture. But I think in that part of the world in those days, prehistoric, or not prehistoric, but BC, let's say, in the Eastern Mediterranean, there was a very, very powerful, for reasons which I don't know that anybody could ever explain, a very powerful impulse toward monotheism, or something more than that, or to put it more generally, a pervasive tendency to try to figure out the one principle of everything. And if you see monotheism as that, then you can see that there's something comparable to it in Greek culture at the time that these images of gods and goddesses were being made, and in their proliferation give us the idea that the Greeks were polytheistic. They were, but what drives these images to have the shapes that they have is something like a monotheistic principle. It comes in a lot of different forms. Each of the major philosophers had his own variety of it. But basically, and Plato's is the most worked out and the most familiar, but it's an idea that there is a realm of the true, the real, the eternal, the abiding, the unchanging, and that it is one, it's unified, and whatever principles of motion or force or passion are in that one, in those motions are generated the particulars that give us our ordinary world of appearances, but to know reality, to know this one, to know this ultimate principle of the cosmos, another Greek word. And it's thought that perhaps the Greeks were the first to think of the cosmos as a cosmos, and to think that perhaps there was only one principle and that all particulars were derived from this general principle. To get to that general principle, you somehow have to see through contingencies, accidents, just the ordinary forms and events of ordinary life. Now, what's so extraordinary about these images is that they are the site where the particular and the general come together in a way that an ancient Greek might characterize as possessing symmetria, in a harmonious way. It's not absolutely equal, the general and the particular, in these works. It's always in favor of the general. There's always a transcendence of the particular. And that's what's going on. That's the point. Now, why would one want to do that? I think it's not just that these are make subject matter of the body. They deal with that aspect of life, namely the body, whose particulars are the most of the most interest and the most potentially difficult, disruptive, and chaotic in their effects. I mean, every culture that survives, every society that survives as a society has to find some way to tone down, bring under control, impose a kind of decorum on the body. And if cultures that don't do that, I mean, that's the meaning of in the Old Testament about Sodom and Gomorrah. If you don't do that, everything collapses. Everything becomes chaotic and disorderly, and ultimately, I suppose in theological terms, it goes to hell. If you want things to be preserved, and by things I mean everything in which one has an interest, there's got, first of all, to be some way to bring those particulars under some kind of control, sanction, as I say, impose some kind of decorum on them. So there's something really to the point about the Greek. It seems sometimes an obsession, like didn't they want to make pictures of anything else or images of anything? But they seem to have focused on this with a great clarity, perhaps not of thought, but of intuition, that if you could impose, if you could make the human form the exemplary instance of overcoming everything dangerous, disruptive, potentially chaotic about the human form, that would be a great triumph. And indeed it was a great triumph. And there's a reason why these forms have become iconic in our culture, because in a certain way they're the foundation of the culture. They're not the only ones perhaps, but they're certainly central to the idea of order, civility, decorum, and the whole range of virtues in Western society. That's why they become iconic. That's why the Venus de Milo becomes a trademark. That's why the Apollo Belvedere becomes a sentimental favorite of Victorian matrons, and that's why Flaubert has this strange episode with a neoclassical sculpture. Precisely not a sexual experience, but one in which that possibility is certainly there. I mean, that's the subject, that's the theme. They're very attractive bodies, and yet I think we can believe Flaubert when he says that this is an aesthetic experience. His homage is to beauty in an aesthetic, not a sexual sense. Now, all of this in a way vanishes in the Middle Ages. There are hardly any nude figures in the Middle Ages. There's some Christs on crosses and so on, but not as many as one might think. I mean, this becomes a real theme only in the early Renaissance, and then with the paganism of the Italian Renaissance, a real revival. This sort of curiosity about antiquities and a sense that there were things to be dug up, in this extraordinary activity of digging up all these old sculptures that went on for centuries. As I mentioned, the Laocoon was exhumed in 1506, and the Vitas de Milo 1820, and there were some famous ones later on in the 19th century. I can't remember which ones. And it still could happen. I mean, there still could be more dug up. But there's this extraordinary interlude where all that I've been talking about, this attempt on the part of the classical Greeks and the Hellenistic Greeks, and then the Romans. I guess we shouldn't completely leave out the Romans. Late Hellenistic. This is Augustus, about 20 BC. This is another missing slide. There's some sinister force was at work at the slide library at the Met, and got hold of the antique, high classical 5th century Athenian prototype of this. Just imagine it nude, and not quite so much of a portrait in the face. You know, that transcending of the particular that I was talking about in ancient mimesis. Tended to make the faces rather blank, and that was not a fault, that was a virtue. This is a portrait of Augustus. It's a rather generalized portrait of Augustus, but the point for his claim to be a god is that this is based on, it's the same pose as the Doryphorus, a famous marble sculpture, and known to the Romans, of course. So the idea is that here is a man in human form who embodies, who's claiming now to be a god. This is right at when the Republic tilts over into becoming the empire, headed by a divine figure. And part of his divinity is signified by, or signaled by this reference to the revered past, because this ancient past, it was ancient for the Romans too. This classical past, the Athenian past, high classicism, was profoundly revered. And while there are a lot of other tendencies in Roman sculpture, extraordinary portraiture, for example, and just sort of almost like genre scenes, like everyday, realistic images in our sense. There was also, at the upper levels of their artistic endeavor, this recapitulation of Athenian classicism, this idea, and here for clear political purposes, that the particular, that is to say, the particular being and life of an individual, Augustus, can transcend itself to that, at the very least, general state of being a divinity. The ordinary reality transcended, so he lives life on some higher plane, and this is an image designed to convince you of that. Now, a different sort of conviction is at work in this. This is Constantine. It's a fragment. It's 8 feet high. It's a fragment, so you can imagine how big the sculpture was when it was whole. But there's something else going on here. The idea of generality the idea of a departure from the ordinary look of things has changed somewhat. You know, in ancient times, in ancient Athens, in the Hellenistic period, and then in the Republic and the early Empire, in Rome, there was this notion of balance, of harmony, of symmetria, that somehow the particular should be acknowledged, but it should be acknowledged in a way that allows us to get beyond it, to something better, to something superior, to something more abstract. But this is, Constantine the Great was, of course, the first Roman emperor to accept Christianity. It's probably pushing it a bit to say that this is the beginning of medieval art, but it's certainly the beginning of a really decisive departure from those classical ideals that are embodied in the notion of rhythmos and symmetria and mimesis. This idea of appearances and reality, that we can pierce the veil of appearances to see a transcendent reality, or we can organize, we can refine, we can beautify ordinary appearances, including such unruly things as hair and toenails and so on, so that they are at one with a transcendent ideal of the eternally real, the eternally true. That balance between ordinary experience and transcendent yearnings begins to give way at this point. And so what gives way is a concern for ordinary appearances. We're on the verge of, there's a sort of a return to schematism here. But it's not a return to the kouros, that archaic stature that precedes the classical statues of ancient Athens. It's a return, it's a departure into what is when this statue was made in the 4th century, was an unknown future. We call it the Dark Ages. Dark because the view of ordinary life somehow became dimmed, and that the intense and the exalted feelings and yearnings were for otherworldly things. This is in line with certain aspects of Christian theology, that the world is a fallen place, and that our life here is just something to be lived through. The phrase "veil of tears" comes to mind. And that we're to get through that in hopes of being saved for a better life after death. So that the focus, which was so intense in classical Athens on particulars, is lost. And we go into the Dark Ages. We go into time when the body, if it appears, has shapes that to us seem grotesque and peculiar, or for the most part, the bodies, say in a cathedral, appear clothed, and their drapery is not the flow of their drapery, unlike those draped figures that I showed you before, doesn't follow the body, doesn't reveal the body, hides the body as the flow of the drapery gets caught up in the filigree and so on of the Gothic style. Now, the thought here was that I'd show you the Adam and Eve as we start coming out of that Gothic period. This is the Ghent altarpiece by Hubert and Jan van Eyck. I hope we have the Adam and Eve here because they are unclothed. Unlike these other figures who are so elaborately clothed, there's still some feeling of Gothic drapery, the kind of drapery that is more in tune with non-human things or superhuman things, rather than so the bodies are sort of taking the body beyond itself. And by swirling the body into a kind of contact, a kind of oneness with the Gothic cathedral, you find a subordination of the individual to the facade, to the hierarchy that the facade represents, and to this otherworldly yearning for heaven. I mean, the upper reaches of a Gothic cathedral are purposely dim as a kind of, we can't see those upper reaches in our earthly state. We can only hope, prodded perhaps by the stained glass windows and their glory, to have some intimation of what it might be like to get out of this earthly state that we're in. Real contrast to the Greek acceptance of the body, acceptance of the flesh, but still the insistence on transcending it. The medieval impulse was more simply to deny it, not to try to harmonize it with something larger, but to deny it and to deny individuality, to deny the bodily presence altogether. Well, we don't have Adam and Eve. But what I wanted to point out with them is something that you can almost see in this familiar picture by Botticelli, The Birth of Venus. It's about 1480. It's one of the chief works of the Renaissance. And we routinely say that the Renaissance was a classical revival. And we point to the paganism of the Renaissance. Here is a pagan theme, Aphrodite or Venus, the birth of Venus. However, there's something in the proportions of this figure that are, you sort of have your choice. We don't really know enough about Botticelli to know whether we should see this sort of elongated proportions, say the elongation of the torso that takes that triangle from the breast to the navel, and stretches it out of the equilateral form that it has in high classicism. And that's one of the things that gives such, there's such subtle motion in the contrapposto, the symmetria, the S-curve of a great classical statue, male or female. But there's also a kind of solidity to it. There's a kind of affinity to the temple form of Greek architecture. The shoulders, the torso. The torso becomes the kind of the pediment for the architecture of the shoulders, the shoulder bone, and the shoulder bone, the collarbones, and the head. So there's this kind of, even though there's an S curve, there's often a sense that there's the right way to see the sculpture is head on. There's this, the torso is flat on in a way that reminds one of the flatness and the frontality, almost aggressive frontality of a Greek temple. This will change, but it hasn't begun to change yet. The proportions are a little different. They're a little less solid. There's something in more willowy, almost liquid about the bodily forms here, which would make sense given the story about Venus's birth that's being told here, riding in on the shell from the ocean. Kind of liquidity of her, or not liquidity, liquidness of these forms, fluidity, maybe a better word. In Botticelli's Primavera, I was going to say about the Venus that you could see it as Hellenistic. You could also see it as Gothic, because that's characteristic of the Gothic. When nudes start to appear in the late Middle Ages and the very early Renaissance, especially nude women, they often have this wonderfully curving sort of belly that you never see in ancient Greek sculpture. And then a kind of narrow waist and an elongated torso, and often a contrapposto, but one that, again, that has that fluidity that makes makes it sometimes in extremes, in chronic and so on, it almost seems kind of rubbery, the form, so it's sort of boneless almost, especially in the female figures. Botticelli doesn't go that far, but there is in the central figure, Primavera, spring, more of a Gothic sense of proportion, and some sense of what I'm talking about, that sort of the way the pleats of the dress, they come as they expand under the breasts, and they swell out, that kind of pear shape, which is Gothic and decidedly unclassical. But then with the three graces, more of a classical proportion. I mean, it puts Botticelli it makes him seem a very interesting figure. That one wonders. I mean, in retrospect, one applies these labels. Say late Gothic, early Renaissance, neoclassical, Hellenistic, and so on. Obviously, he didn't do that. Didn't think of it that way, but he was thinking of it in a way that leads us to think of it that way now. In other words, that he seems to have been aware of all these options that were available to him in presenting the body. That it could be still related to that kind of boneless body of the late Middle Ages, or it could be related to these very sturdy, and I think it's almost literally correct to say architectural bodies that were being dug up in his time in Italy. So that this is, I mean, there's always a danger of using works of art as means of illustrating ideas that one has about history, but it's also well to remember in the case of these artists of the Italian Renaissance that they were very aware of history and thought of themselves as having come out of a time when history was ignored, when generally life on earth was ignored. What went on in the Vale of Tears, this fallen world, was in a way incidental and forgettable. There was no real sense of history in the way we think of it in the Middle Ages. I mean, we can piece together histories of events and so on, but there was no historical imagination. What we find, and this is really quite not the earliest early Renaissance figure, but a fairly early Renaissance figure, Botticelli, a historical imagination at work. That he's not just presenting different kinds of bodies for different kinds of delectation, present different kinds of beauty, but is driven by some sense of a kind of evolution of an ideal. And that but it's hard to know how he meant that. This is going back a bit. Botticelli was, in a way, archaicizing. His historical imagination tended to attracted him to the recent past in a way that was not the case for this artist, Donatello. This is his David, a bronze from around 1432. It's about half a century earlier than the Venus, Botticelli's Venus. This is a truly neoclassical work. In other words, a work of classical revival. The historical imagination focusing very, very sharply and acutely, brilliantly on what was becoming known of the ancient past. This David, the first thing that's extraordinary about it is that he would present David, this Old Testament figure, as a Greek god. That's an amazing sort of displacement that it shows that a Renaissance imagination to sort of taking total charge of a theme and reworking it according to what he considers to be the proper tenets. There was coming out of the late Middle Ages, or one of the signs that we are in the late Middle Ages and that indifference to ordinary life. Another thing that didn't happen much in aside from Christ on crosses, besides nude figures that didn't occur much in the Middle Ages was portraiture. And one of the signs that the Middle Ages are coming to an end is the reappearance of portraiture. As I mentioned, that extraordinary period of portraiture in the late Republic and early Empire in Rome, and then starting with that Constantine thing, with that sort of staring face, which is not any face in particular, but just sort of a generic face in the form of an overbearing presence. After that, portraiture just about disappears more thoroughly than the nude disappears in the Middle Ages. And then it reappears, and then Donatello, who's certainly aware of this, gives a kind of generality, takes away the portrait quality from this face. This is part of his conscious program of classical revival, because as I mentioned earlier, that's characteristic of in that transition, in that attempt to modify the particular with the general. One of the strategies of the classical sculptors was to make the face proportionate and decorous and so on, but bland in a way, so that you have none of the attraction or repulsion that you might feel toward a specific face. See? I mean, the Greeks. It's not. The Greeks seem have some of the most powerful images, especially in the tragic poets, about the power of those particulars, which are those of the face or of the body. And they always come out when somebody is lamenting, like Phaedra is lamenting this disastrous crush that she has on Hippolytus. You know, I mean, it's not just that she realizes this is a bad idea to fall in love with her stepson. It's that love is a sharp-edged sword. A flaming arrow. She talks about being torn by these feelings. And all that imagery of cutting and chopping and being torn, it reflects the Greek sense that a really intense, or in Phaedra's case, obsessive focus on particulars. Of course, the most particular particulars, the most intensely particular particulars, those of another body, another presence, that this is the most fragmenting, this is the most chaotic, this is the most divisive sort of thing that can happen. This is the source of the greatest, this is the greatest potential for chaos. And so to create images of order, to present exemplary instances of order, the first thing that one has to do in dealing with a human body is to do away with the particularity of the face, as Donatello does here. And it's not that he can't do portraits. I mean, there are extraordinary portraits in his statues around the cathedral in Florence, very particular people. And that notion of the individual. I mean, he fits these individual, they're usually called prophets. No one knows exactly who they are, but they seem clearly to be the result of work that's done from the model. But they're fitted to classical proportions, and yet they step apart from the stone, unlike Gothic figures. They're there as individuals, and they were thought, it's thought now, that they were understood in their time as embodiments of virtues, in each one a particular virtue, civic virtues, public virtues. So the self is coming out into the public space, the idea of the citizen is developing, and so on. And this is a little difficult to reconcile with this art ideal that is inherited from ancient times and is still so powerful, the idea that art should be some kind of transcendence. And of course, the only transcendence worth the name is a transcendence towards something general, something ultimate, something absolute, or as we might say, something abstract. And so Donatello makes sure that he does something like this, where the sort of the basis of his art is given without any compromise, I shouldn't say compromise, but without any qualification, the kind of qualification that's brought to bear when you work from a particular model, when you work for a particular civic project, when you have a certain audience in mind. This is to be addressed to the ages. This, because it's to embody, it's to be understood, it's to be seen and understood as embodying the eternal ideals, timeless ideals. There's another, I was talking about that, things we can't really know about Botticelli, how conscious he was of within the same picture offering different ideals of the female body. Here we can't quite know if Donatello's departures from a classical ideal are conscious or unconscious, or if they were conscious, they were intended. But he's a little slimmer than he would be if he'd been made by someone in 5th century Athens. There's a kind of litheness, and it's not Hellenistic. I wouldn't say that that's what's going on, that it's something new. And it may have something to do with a shift in the architecture of the body. And this is why it's really impossible ultimately to confuse a Renaissance sculpture with an ancient Athenian sculpture. Remember I was saying that symmetry of the S-curve and so on never disrupted the overriding effect of solidity, that sort of temple front structure. The torso as the basis of it, where the columns would be, and the shoulder and head and so on, the cornice. That structure, which in architecture is absolutely rigid, or looks rigid, is infused with rhythmos by way of mimetic devices and so on, to have this kind of bodily litheness. But what really predominates ultimately is that clarity and that solidity of the temple structure. But architecture has changed in the Renaissance, and the torso is no longer the center of it. The center is more near the actual center of the body, namely the waist. And what's going on here, I think, keep referring to architecture, because what's new in the Renaissance is the dome, this radial form. And as Renaissance sculpture develops, you see more and more turning from the waist. In other words, it's not this flat frontal presentation of whatever it is, a building or a body. It's in a dome, a radial form, a circular form, around which within which you can circulate, literally go in a circle. And in the sculpture, which is static, it's more that there's a potential for that kind of movement from the waist, that moving around. This in a sense changes everything. It's amazing how you can change everything, but that certain basic premises about harmony, unity, and the point of the methods of transcendence and the point of transcendence persist. But this is a new style. It's neoclassicism. It's not classicism, or it's Renaissance classicism. Later, this is more around the time, maybe a decade or so earlier than the Botticelli, which is 1480. This is thought to be 1470, 1475. Paoleulo, the Battle of the Nudes. It's as if we see here an artist who has noticed, as if it could be missed, that the nude figure, once again, is at the center of Western art. And this was still news in a way. I mean, this was still something fresh then, because the Middle Ages went on for a long time, and its way, the medieval sensibility's way of obscuring the body, or presenting it in a kind of boneless, spiritualized way that had nothing to do, really, with one's ordinary bodily experience, that had gone on for many, many centuries. So, you know, in the late 15th century, this idea that the nude had some figure had sort of marched to the center of the stage once again was fresh, and Paoleulo is giving a demonstration of his command of this new topic, this newly central topic. And in the course of doing it, we see that sort of radial, that the real innovation in the Renaissance nude, that radial motion of which the nude is now capable. I mean, remember, even with the discus thrower, it's a pretty extreme posture, but still, or as I said at the time, extreme contrapposto, but still, it's within that flat, planar arrangement of that's typical of classical sculpture, and even the Laocoon. I mean, in a way, Laocoon, the large figure wrestling with the snake, is just as lively and just as embattled as any of these figures, but still, he maintains the decorum of that ancient architectural ideal, and the torso is still the center. Here, the waist is the center. People bend forward, people bend back, people twist, and so on. It's not a full inventory of what one can do by bending one's waist this way or that, but it goes a lot farther than anybody had ever gone before in a single image, in insisting on that point. There's a new, you could say that they'd redefined that quality of rhythmos. They'd given it a new dimension, which is to say that it carries more vigorously and more deliberately into 3 dimensions. Now this is where I want to, this is the last slide I want to show tonight. This is Michelangelo's David. It's from 1501, 04. I'm sure most of you have seen it. It's over 13 feet high. It stands out in the open in Florence, in front of the Academy. Here, I want to talk tomorrow night about many more images of Michelangelo's, and from them carry on through the Baroque, into the Rococo, into neoclassicism in the 18th century sense, and on to Romanticism in modern times. But just as I said that Venus de Milo could have been on the screen the whole time, well, up to the point, I guess we get the Venus de Milo, then Donatello's David. That flat frontal contrapposto versus that focuses on the torso, versus, or succeeded by, that radial kind of contrapposto that focuses on the waist. In a way, everything I have to say about the nude from this moment on could be said with this on the screen. It's all here in potential, which is sort of a Michelangelo-esque idea, and maybe one I should steer away from, because it's basically Neoplatonic. His idea that the great sculptor sees the block of marble and somehow can see the form in it, as if it's an essence. But you have brute matter, but there's some kind of spiritual essence in it that can be revealed if you remove brute matter in a certain way to form a form like this. Again, that's that appearance reality argument, which I think is very dubious. It's not that it can be disproven, but again, I think ultimately everything is on the surface. And so that means that these ideas about appearance and reality, these ideas that there are depths, there should be some way of seeing the surface of those ideas that reveals what they're really about. And I think I have an idea. I hope I can get to it as we move on from Michelangelo, but about all the things that are in potential here, or that will be worked out in later centuries. First of all, the face. Different from Donatello's face, which was the face of his David, which was similar to the faces of ancient classical sculpture. It's not exactly a portrait, this face, but it doesn't have that blankness. The point of the blankness of a classical sculpture is that no personal or particular interchange developed between any member of the audience and the sculpture itself. Now, thinking back to that Flaubert incident, he has to be very careful to say that it's not these particular images of bodies that aroused him, that he wasn't aroused in a bodily sense, that in a way he could have this ecstatic, even physical relationship with the sculpture, and yet it still wouldn't be what we would normally think of or ordinarily think of as a physical relationship with a human form. That it's just a very intense moment of a contact with a general idea, an idea of beauty, a transcendent idea of perfection. And that's the need for that blankness in those faces. That if you can look into the eyes of a sculpture or a painted a portrait, then it's not merely that the person being represented, or the body, the figure being represented is more personalized. You're more personalized, or you're doing something that accentuates or gives a kind of focus to your own individuality. The idea of ancient sculpture is that you be a member of the audience, not as an individual, not as your particular self, but as a member of the community that is devoted to the values and to the yearnings for transcendence that are made visible in the sculpture, that are embodied in the sculpture. Now, I'm not saying that we've gotten quite to the point where you can first of all, it's 13 feet high and it's up on a high pedestal, so there's nobody's going to be really looking into the eyes of this sculpture. It's monumental. It's on a plane. It's another Aristotelian idea that tragedy is about kings and comedy is about lowlier creature. This is about King David. This is about a kingly that plays down the fact that I'm looking at it, that you're looking at it. It's to be part of something that transcends us, so that the very impersonality of the experience may be the first step toward the transcendence that the experience is supposed to bring. This is in a kind of halfway place, because the face is looking out. This face is alive. It's not looking at us, and we're not positioned to be able to look into this face, but it's alive in a way that a classical sculpture's face is not. There are other things about it. The contrapposto is a brilliant variation on traditional contrapposto, or even on Donatello's contrapposto and his David. But there's something about it that's it's not simply an integration of these lower bodily forms into a generalized idea of symmetria or harmony. It's more particular than that. This is a particular stance. Like he's looking out at something, and his stance reflects a sense of responding to something in particular, certainly more particular than any ancient statue is responding to. They may be responding to nothing at all, simply presenting themselves. And the way the hands are placed and their posture, I mean, it's extraordinary to say in a way, but the hands themselves have postures. There's a certain tenseness about them. I mean, there's a certain sense of this figure being poised, not simply posed in a proper contrapposto or S-curve or whatever. All of that's there. All of those proprieties are there, but they've been inflected. They've been inflected by some degree of particularity. This is a particular, it might be going too far to say that this David has a personality, a definite personality. This is not art. We haven't gotten beyond mimesis to expression art, or expressionist art, or the expression theory of art. Michelangelo was a great favorite of the Romantics, but he's not a Romantic artist. This isn't personal expression, and this David is not expressing anything in our sense of that word. And I don't think that we can exactly empathize with him. Another modern idea pops up in the 18th century, the idea that you can have some kind of intuitive contact, first of all with another person, but then also with an image of another person if it's well enough done, if it's done empathetically enough. But I don't think we can quite do that, but all that's in potential here. We're on the verge of that. But just a parenthetical thought. Just as I said, we don't really know what Flaubert was, how he's reacting to that Canova sculpture, and one can have any sort of reaction to anything. It's also possible for us, or maybe it's impossible for us not to have an empathetic response to this. Because that's how we view human figures, whether they're in snapshots or in advertisements or in museums or in the piazza in Florence or whatever. But I think it's worth the effort to get past that automatic response, which would be appropriate to something done in our own time. Say, a George Siegel, the melancholy and silence of a George Siegel figure. And to realize that Michelangelo, it's got too much of classicism, too brilliantly portrayed, and too clearly portrayed for us to think that it would be presumptuous in a certain way to try to feel empathetic with this figure. And yet, we're not still in the world of, we've gotten beyond the world of classical decorum and so on. And it's not just a matter of form. There is a sense, and it's amazing that Michelangelo can do this. He can completely recapitulate that temple form of the body with the torso as the main element, the element to which everything else relates, and at the same time, extremely subtly in this case. It won't be so subtle in some of his later images, in the Sistine Chapel or in the tomb sculptures. But here, an extraordinary subtle inflection of the waist that puts it in the realm of the Renaissance body, the radial body, the body where the waist is the center. And all of these things together, the departures from the recapitulation of classicism and then the departures from classicism give this a quality that no classical sculpture has, and I don't think the Donatello David has. It's a word that's kind of hard to translate. It was a word that was applied to Michelangelo's works in his own time, prontezza, the idea of alertness or being ready. He's on the verge of a response to something. And it's not important what, because this is not a narrative sculpture. It's a sculpture about a kind of presence, a presence that has taken all the new things of the Renaissance and literally and literally because it's over 13 feet high, but figuratively as well, given them a monumental presence. And you can't quite sum it up, but that feeling of prontezza, you know, of being about alertness. That's new. The other quality, there are two other words. These are not exactly comparable to the ancient Greek words, rhythmos and symmetria and mimesis. In fact, they're not comparable at all. Or there's no parallelism that I want to draw here. But But there are a couple of other words I want to mention as a way into the modern period. Well, first of all, Michelangelo, then into the modern period. Another untranslatable Italian word, sprezzatura, which can be translated in a lot of different ways, and I'm sure was meant in a lot of different ways. But it had to do, the main place in English to find out what might have been meant by sprezzatura in the Italian Renaissance is Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, where he talks about what it is to be noble. And it's very different from what it was to be noble in the Middle Ages. To be noble in the Middle Ages was not all that different from being a warlord in Afghanistan. I mean, it's just, you know, there were certain virtues of intelligence and daring and recklessness and sheer violent capacity for violence and so on, that became associated with nobility simply because it's the people who exhibited those characteristics the most powerfully who became the nobles. But this changes. One of the ways to think of the Renaissance is as a self-conscious exercise in becoming civilized. This is the time when the moats begin to be filled in, and because you don't have the kind of people who you have to keep out. I mean, the countryside isn't as dangerous as it was, and at a certain point in the Renaissance, big houses, palaces, palazzos begin to be built without moats. And nobility, of course, has to do with monopoly on violence and so on. These are the people who, if power needs to be exercised in a violent form, these are the people who are entitled to do so legitimately, and the monarchy as well. But still, the level of violence goes down, and it's not quite so easy to tell who's noble or what noble characteristics are. So there's a great discussion about this. And one of the terms that came out of it, not that it was invented for this, but that it became crucial to the discussion, is the idea of sprezzatura. It had to do with a certain kind of elegance. Refinement had something to do with it, but more elegance and unforced elegance, offhand elegance. There's a point where one of the people in the dialogue in the Book of the Courtier talk about people who read too many books, or they study too much, or they try too hard. You know, this is a sign that one lacks this quality of grace or elegance. That one, it may not be true, but that one can display refinement and elegance in an offhand, unpremeditated way. One may, in fact, work hard at it, but one has to give the appearance, if one wants to have this noble demeanor, one has to give the appearance of doing it in an offhand way, a natural way, as if one were simply born to it, whether it's riding a horse or fencing or playing a musical instrument. Obviously, you can't play a musical instrument just naturally. But you have to give the impression, if you don't have to, I mean, but if you want to be praised as having this quality of sprezzatura, elegance, dignity, refinement, but a kind of offhandedness as well. Now, prontezza, which is a kind of intensity, and sprezzatura, which implies a kind of casualness, a kind of unthinking grace, don't exactly, I mean, they don't fit together in any logical way. But that's not really a problem in art. That the qualities that you find in a work of art don't fit together in a logical way. And I think that there is a kind of, those qualities that Castiglione and the people in his dialogue talk about, I think can be seen here. Because there's not only that extraordinary intensity of the presence of this figure, there's not only the great invocation of this awesome, dignified, transcendent past, there's also this sort of feeling that this is a young man who's capable of a certain casualness, a kind of offhandedness. There's something, sometimes this David is described as an adolescent, a monumental, of course, but still an adolescent. He has a kind of, I wouldn't say carefree attitude, but that kind of, well, I don't know exactly what to call it, but one, I think that those two qualities somehow do coexist in this form. The third word that hovers around Michelangelo, terribilità, I think is not here, unless one is right in front of the statue and feels really overwhelmed by the fact that it's over 13 feet high. I mean, it's not, it is monumental, but it doesn't have that. We'll be seeing that next time when God is creating Adam or, whatever. But I want to mention it now, simply because I mentioned 3 Greek words, so I think I should mention 3 Italian words. And also because it will be perhaps more important than some of these other, the other two in talking about the later Michelangelo. But terribilità, I don't know if it's accurate or not, but it's the one that's the most easily translated into English. It usually, it's equated with the idea of the sublime. And maybe we can attach that word to this figure, but it's clearer in other works by Michelangelo. The idea, and this is another idea of transcendence. It was around in late in the late. Well, it's not really clear when it's the idea of the sublime entered the discourse, as people say. 1st century BC, 1st century AD. A Roman writer by the name of Longinus wrote a treatise on the sublime, where, and this is all, I sort of want to open things out and leave them in a kind of disassembled state so I can maybe put them back together tomorrow night. He was noticing, I mean, there were all these, I've been talking about these ideas of decorum and propriety, and these generally shared ideals of harmony and order and so on. Now, this led neoclassicists of the Renaissance in the 17th and 18th century to suppose that there were such things as rules of art. Nobody ever formulated them, but they talked about them a lot. And there was this kind of assumption that if there was an order, and everybody was sort of committed to believing that there was, and that great art revealed this order, that there must be rules. I mean, that's how it works in law, that's how it works in engineering, that's how it works in the natural sciences. Surely it would work the same way in art. So that idea was not so interesting in ancient times, but you do get Horace and other people talking about the rules of art. And Longinus pointed out that rules of art or decorum or anything that would seem to give you a kind of guide of how to proceed as an artist, in the greatest artists, was often ignored. There are all sorts of odd things in Homer, in Aeschylus, things that, he doesn't obey the meter, the rhyme isn't quite, or there's indecorousness in the metaphor. There's a comic effect where you might expect a tragic effect. There are, and Longinus said, well, of course, sometimes these are merely faults, but sometimes they work, and you realize that what's really great about Homer or Aeschylus or Phidias or Praxiteles or anybody who's really great is that on occasion, and sometimes this is where their greatness is the most evident, they completely ignored decorum, or what people would like to think of as the rules. Well, there wasn't much of a market for this thought in ancient times, and his treatise vanished, but it was one of the few of all the endless treatises on various subjects that were written in ancient times that resurfaced. It was resurfaced, it was translated first in the 1670s, I think, in France, and then it was translated into English. And the notion, the quality that Longinus was talking about, both in French and in English, was translated as the sublime. This concept went through a lot of evolution from the 17th century through Romanticism and into the works or the imagination of Barnett Newman. The word isn't exactly in circulation anymore, but I think it's something that we intuitively have a sense of. So that what we're going to get with Michelangelo, when we look at him in more detail next time, is the way this infusion of a kind of, a new kind of life that attracted the word prontezza, and a new set of values, a new set of ideas, or a new sensibility, a new way to define refinement and elegance, which attracted the word sprezzatura, then leads on to the notion of terribilità, the terrible in the sense of the awesome or the awe-inspiring or the sublime. And whether or not we can see it here David is sort of up to each one of us individually, but I guess the point I'd like to stop with is that we're, just as this figure seems to be on the verge of something, doing something, responding to something, perhaps saying something. Well, we know what he's going to do. He's going to kill Goliath, but that's not part of the picture, and we don't actually have to bring that to mind to get that sense of prontezza, that sense of his being on the verge of something. Also, this sculpture brings us and our culture and our sense of art to the verge of something that I'd like to talk about next time. Thank you.